The 8th oldest car company in existence when it was canceled in 2004, with a long history of innovation. It produced over 35 million vehicles. It had the 3rd best-selling brand for several years. It was sold 1 million a year from 83 to 86, including having the best-selling car in the US. And like many, I believe just as the brand and the styling was having a revival, it was canceled due to low sales. This is a far too brief history of Oldsmobile.
This is time. This is not your father's Oldsmobile. This is the new generation of Oldsmobile.
Now, like many of those of a certain era, I have fond memories of Oldsmobile. My family had several, and I always had really high opinions of them right up until, well, they were canceled. This is a company that it's not unfair to say helped to change the world, and I think it's largely forgotten. It was founded in 1897 as the Olds Motor Vehicle Company by a gentleman named Ransom E. Olds, after he developed a steam car in 1887 at just 22 years old. As a matter of fact, this was the first car ever sold to someone outside of the United States, but unfortunately the ship it was on sunk and it was lost, and that never happened. By 1901, he had a gas car and he sold 635 cars, making it the very first high-volume producer of gas-powered vehicles in a time when electrics and steam power was still king of the road. Also by 1901, the company had developed a whole line of models ready for production. However, the factory caught fire, and 2 workers took one of these pre-production models and managed to push it out before the factory burned up. This was the prototype for the curved dash Oldsmobile. But initially, Olds ended up having to use subcontractors to keep production going, including Henry Leland, you may have heard of, who founded Cadillac and Lincoln, and a little company by the name of the Dodge Brothers. Now, from 1902 to 1907, the curved dash was the first mass-produced car. Olds invented the assembly line, which is normally incorrectly attributed to Ford, when he actually created the moving assembly line. Now, for reasons I'm not clear on, Ransom ended up leaving in some sort of dispute in 1904, and he formed the REO Motor Car Company. If that sounds familiar, then yes, they produce an ancestor of the modern truck called the REO Speedwagon. And while their cars were modestly successful in 1936, that company chose to focus on trucks, ultimately becoming part of White Motor Company. They, within White, were merged with Diamond T Company and continued to create big trucks, typically things for fire trucks and things like that. And yes, they called it Diamond Rio Trucks. If you've ever heard of the band Diamond Rio, yes, that is where they got their name from too. Interestingly, there was some liquidation, there was some bankruptcy. Ended up that Volvo actually ended up with White after this bankruptcy, and in 1957, Volvo owns the rights to the REO name. So Swedish manufacturer that's not Swedish anymore actually owns one of the names of what was once Oldsmobile. Little side note. However, in 1905, there was also a hit song called In My Merry Oldsmobile.
Come away with me, Lucille, in my merry Oldsmobile. Down the road of life we'll fly, automobile bubbling, you and I.
It gave the company plenty of free advertising. They had an animated feature with it and had the curved dash Oldsmobile in it as well. And they would go ahead and reference this song on and off in their advertising for decades.
There he comes now in his merry Oldsmobile.
In 1908, General Motors purchased the company, and Olds began as a GM division with Buick and sharing platforms with Buick. In 1910, Oldsmobile introduced the Limited Touring Series 23. This was an ambitious car priced at $4,600, which would be about $135,000 in today's dollars. A limo version was also produced, which was priced at $5,800. Now, they only sold about 725 in 3 years, but at the time, it was considered cutting edge and included a 60 horsepower T-head straight six, a Bosch magneto starter, running boards were standards, and it had options for a speedometer, a clock, and a full glass windshield. This was cutting edge stuff at the time. In 1912, they offered the Series 40 as a more affordable option, and later in 1916, they added the Light 8. Both used a Cadillac flathead V8 until 1923. By the 1920s, the brand offered the Oldsmobile 6 in 5 different body styles, all based on the B platform that they shared with Buick. They also introduced a slightly pricier Viking brand intended to fill in gaps in the General Motors pricing structure, but it was discontinued by 1931, selling only about 7,000 units in 29 and 30. Fascinating, because I'd never even heard of it. In the 1930s, Oldsmobile offered 2 different body styles. The Series F had a straight 6, and the longer Series L had a straight 8. While Olds still had a reputation for innovation and luxury, the end of the 30s is really when they started to be known for their innovation. Because in 1937, they introduced something called the automatic safety transmission. Now, this was actually started in Cadillac, doing a lot of the research into it, and this was a 4-speed semi-automatic transmission that was actually built by Buick and used by them in 1938. You had to actually press a clutch in and then select either low or high. If you selected low gear, you got first and second, and high, you got first, third, and fourth. But once you selected that, it changed gears automatically. Now, the AST was short-lived, as Olds was the first manufacturer to offer a fully automatic transmission in 1940, the Hydromatic. It had 4 forward speeds with no clutch pedal. It was a $57 option, which would be about $1,100 in today's dollars. And Olds ads can actually be seen instructing people how to use it, because it was still so unusual to not have a clutch.
Keep your eye on the driver's right hand. See? Even as she slows down smoothly and stops for a traffic sign, she has both hands on the wheel. Even as she starts up again and pulls away from traffic, there's no gear shifting, no clutch pushing. All she does is steer the car and operate the accelerator.
Interestingly, Chevy ended up having their own automatic transmission later that was smoother but less efficient than the Hydromatic. When auto production stopped for World War II, it's worth noting that this transmission actually ended up being used in some tanks. Starting in 1941, Olds started using a 2-digit model designation. Originally, the first digit was the body size, while the second digit was the number of cylinders. Now, the body sizes would run between 6 and 9, and Olds offered 6 and 8 options. So, if you remember the old Oldsmobile Delta 88 or 98, that's where it actually came from, 1941 naming conventions. The last pre-war Oldsmobile was built in February 5th, 1942, and in October 1945, they resumed production of automobiles with a warmed-over 1942 model. And then, history was about to be made, because in 1949, Oldsmobile offered the Rocket engine, an overhead valve V8 that produced far more horsepower than the common flathead engines of the era. Buick and Cadillac had versions as well, with the initial Olds version being a 5-liter engine. Now, there's tons of variations of this moving forward in history, but the Rocket engine became associated with the brand. Best of all, while the Olds and Caddy engines were all distantly related, the divisions were allowed to coordinate with each other, leading to a series of V8s that were well known and respected for being excellent, smooth, and very reliable. Now, as the 1950s dawned, Oldsmobile began focusing its marketing and styling around this now famous Rocket engine and the space race. In 1954, the, quote, sweet cut fender styling was introduced that was later adopted by Chevy and Pontiac. The wraparound windshield, open grills to remind buyers of fighter jets, twin jet pod styled taillights, and in 1958 the division changed its logo to reflect itself as the Rocket Division. Olds also changed their model naming again, with trim levels being added. For example, the 88 would have the Dynamic 88 at the base and the upscale Super 88. Hardtops would be called a Holiday, and station wagons were a Fiesta. While everything seemed great in the 50s for Olds, and with these styling changes reminiscent of the space race and advanced engines leading their cars to be among the fastest out there, trouble was looming, because in 1957 Chrysler introduced a new styling direction called Forward Look, which made not just Oldsmobile but other GM cars look dated immediately. In addition, both Olds and Buicks had adopted a strato roof design meant to be reminiscent of a canopy from the B-36 Peacemaker bomber, and consumers hated the roof and its blind spots, and so GM was in a rush to redesign. This was also a time of a recession leading to a sales decline, so Olds, Buick, and Cadillac all received what's considered a very heavy-handed makeover for the 58 model year. They all came out looking nothing like their predecessors, and instead as ostentatious, over-decorated chrome-mobiles. They were so bad that in the early 60s, a designer that worked at Ford bought a 58 Olds used and drove it to work to remind himself and co-workers of what bad auto design looked like. Okay, I think that's a bit harsh. After this misstep, the Olds lineup was completely redesigned again for 59, leaning even more heavily into the rocket motif, including chrome rockets on the front fenders and fins shaped like rocket exhausts ending in a fin-top taillight. This look was continued in 1960, but tuned down a little bit. Beyond styling, many 59s also offered power windows, 2-speed electric windshield wipers with electric-powered washers, a dash-mounted auto-dimming feature for the headlights, factory air conditioning, and power-operated front bench seats. The 1960s and Olds was back on track with the first modern front-wheel drive car produced in the U.S. since Cord in 1937. It was the 1966 Toronado. The Vista Cruiser had its famous glass roof, and the legendary 442 was born. Now, the 442 began in 1964 as an option package for the F85 Cutlass. It had a 4-barrel carb, a 4-speed transmission, and 2 exhausts. The original engine was a 330 cubic inch with 310 horsepower, and in 65 was replaced with a 400 cubic inch rated at 345. And the 442 definition had to change.
We're off the beaten path, demonstrating the newest high-performance vehicle of the year. The Oldsmobile 442. 400 cubic inch V8 engine, 345 horsepower. 4-barrel carburation. 2 dual exhausts. 442 by Oldsmobile. Instant action, a new breed of car. This is the design, beauty on the run.
In 1968, the 442 became its own model and had in 1970 an ever larger engine, 455 cubic inches. It's interesting that a couple of models introduced to the brand in the 60s, like the Starfire and the slightly obscure Jetstar, didn't survive past the 60s, while others like the Toronado and Cutlass survived until the 90s, including the Cutlass being a bestseller. But I get ahead of myself. Specifically, when the Toronado was introduced, it was a personal luxury car and was the largest and most powerful front-wheel drive car ever, and was one of the first with an automatic transmission. With a 425 cubic inch super rocket V8 with a 3-speed turbo hydromatic, it was Motor Trend's Car of the Year and went on to be the only American car ever to get 3rd place in the European Car of the Year. This momentum continued into the 70s, and the 80s were good for Oldsmobile. Models were refreshed, reviews were good, perceived quality and reliability were good, and sales were up strongly. Oldsmobile passed both Pontiac and Plymouth to become the 3rd best-selling brand in the nation. And in the late 70s and again in the 80s, annual sales topped 1 million units a year, something that only Ford and Chevy had ever achieved. The Cutlass Supreme was the best-selling car for 3 years in the 80s, non-consecutively.
From the look, the style, the grace, you know immediately this is a thoroughbred. The Oldsmobile Cutlass Supreme for 1984.
Unfortunately, in the midst of their success, storm clouds were brewing, and it was because of old successes, GM struggle, and honestly corporate hubris. First, many Olds weren't very different from their GM brand's offering. Now, Oldsmobile had been sharing platforms with Buick since their very first years. But Olds found itself struggling to stand out from a crowded field that included Buick, Chevy, Pontiac. How were they going to be fitting in? And it became less clear for what was an Oldsmobile and what made it different. While I find most Olds models to be handsome, they weren't always winning customers who were tired of cookie-cutter look-alike cars. Second, that strong sales success from the 70s led to shortages of Oldsmobile V8s, specifically for the Delta 88, and GM decided that they would just take some Chevy engines and put them in Oldsmobiles. Now, many loyal Oldsmobile customers wanted Olds quality and the Rocket V8, and they didn't know they had a Chevy engine until later when they went to have some work done on it or bought replacement parts for it. This became a public relations nightmare for GM, and afterwards their sales literature was changed and advertisements began stating, quote, Oldsmobiles are equipped with engines produced by various GM divisions, a statement that still applies, kind of, except all GM engines are now produced by GM Powertrain and are considered corporate engines. And the third one was the Oldsmobile diesel fiasco. As I reported in my top engineering fails video, Olds took a gas engine, they strengthened it, and they converted it to diesel, and while initially sales were successful, these engines suffered from a variety of catastrophic failures, and it's really only a slight exaggeration to say that the Olds diesel and the fiasco around it was so widespread it ruined generations of Americans on diesel engines. But through all of this, Olds still had its best years with strong consumer loyalty for perceived quality. My family was one of them. So after the 80s, things started to turn downhill pretty quickly. Sales of over 1 million in 1985 dropped to about 400,000 by 1993. Not only struggling with other GM divisions, but also now they were facing these upstart premium brands from Acura, Infiniti, and Lexus. GM continued to use Olds as a showpiece of new technology, such as their visual instrument cluster in the Toronado Trofeo, a prototype with early satellite-based navigation, an Indy pace car with the first production heads-up display, and the Aerotech breaking the world speed record at 267 miles an hour. I really want to highlight that they had a color touchscreen interface with a built-in cellular phone in the 1990 Trofeo. Yes, in 1990, GM had a primitive infotainment system that they could install in a car. Now, in the face of these declining sales, Olds began overhauling its models and its naming structure. The Achieva, the Alero.
Alero turns your everyday commute into a new driving experience. With room for 5, your choice of coupe or sedan, and standard features you won't find on the competition. Get inside this sculpted asphalt magnet and get connected to the road in an entirely new way.
The Aurora, the Intrigue, the Silhouette, and the Bravada were all new names as they retired things like the Cutlass. Some were beautiful and took Olds in a great new design direction, especially the underappreciated Aurora.
When something brand new, something fresh and exhilarating, comes into your life at the exact moment you're ready, screamingly ready for it, it's not coincidence. Aurora by Oldsmobile. See what happens when you demand better?
Other models didn't hide their corporate roots very well, and as such, the Bravada and the Silhouette were, in my mind, poor attempts to brand engineer Olds to higher volume sales. It failed, and proved that, to me anyway, GM couldn't learn from its mistakes. In spite of some critical successes with the new models and styling, Sales remained disappointing, and GM finally announced in December of 2000 it was shutting down Oldsmobile, just 3 years after the company turned 100. The final Oldsmobile was an Alero, built in April of 2004. After 100 years and amazing models and innovation, the death of Oldsmobile was perhaps inevitable. The world had changed from the days of the high-flying rocket division, and Olds struggled to fit in, not only within a congested corporate structure, but also with outside competition. Too many look-alike cars made it just one division too many within GM. Too many badge-engineered cars of poor quality damaged the division's reputation. And perhaps the simple fact that we live in a world where the word Oldsmobile has the word old in it. It was doomed to fail eventually. Buick, buoyed by its strong sales in China, managed to solidify itself in that middle of the GM lineup as a premium selection, while Chevy models could be stretched up in price and content to kind of fill in the bottom of what Oldsmobile used to serve. Most tragically for Olds and for GM is that many innovations were corporately forgotten over the decades, only to be made popular again by other brands. The first automatic transmission, the Hydromatic, had a 4-speed, yet cars of my youth through the 80s, like the Cutlass Supreme or the Regal that I had 3-speed automatics. Automatic dimming headlights. The glass roof on the Vista Cruiser, very popular option you now see in a lot of sport utilities. Infotainment, satellite navigation, all of these were innovations that GM led only to let others win with. Olds was a car brand of another time, but for decades it was one of the best. And honestly, for this guy right here, it's one of the saddest stories that it's no longer with us today. Thank you for watching this video. Thank you for taking a little trip down memory lane with me to a brand that I really miss and that I loved. If you haven't, please subscribe, please like this video, and if you haven't noticed, we do have a Patreon page now where you can help support independent automotive creator like myself, and in future videos at the Focus Hatchback tier, you will get your name down below showing your support so you can brag to all of your friends that you're helping create more videos just like this. Thanks.